you, Professor Sherman. I appreciate that. Before I begin the talk proper, allow me a few observations. First, we are gathered here today because we are worried. And we are worried for good reason. I believe, in addition, that we are here today because we are confused. And that confusion is a reflection of a broader conflict embodied by the response to the outbreak, however brave our responders are. CDC and Doctors Without Borders, for sure, but also many an everyday Liberian and Sierra Leonean who, in their danger, handling their dead and treating their sick, by extension partake in the kindness to us all. The confusion arises out of a number of dissonances in what we might call institutional cognition, how organizations make decisions. At one and the same time, shades of Albert Camus, our health authorities claim we need not panic, but they are clearly alarmed, and in some circumstances, if the news out of Sierra Leone is any indication, are out of their depth. In an understandable attempt to refute bigotry, our authorities claim the virus's modes of transmission are well understood. And yet Dallas follows Madrid in a nurse in full protective gear infected. CDC Director Thomas Frieden appears to pass the buck of a breach of protocol onto the poor nurse. But such accidents, likely intrinsic to every epicenter, may represent more a failing of the protocol. Knowledge and practice and means are decidedly orthogonal to each other. And as we'll touch on, the relationship is structurally dependent. Of course, there's the matter that a virus needn't be airborne to kill millions. HIV, for one, is really hard to get. You really have to work at it. And yet, here we are, 35 million infections today. Ebola's case fatality rate doesn't bode well either. If 50 million people died in 1918's influenza pandemic at 2.5% case fatality, that means 2 billion people were infected. At the 50% case fatality rate now, Ebola will need only 100 million infections to match 1918's death toll. Of course, we should hope, and better yet, act so it doesn't come to that. Authorities claim a socioeconomic cordon sanitaire between industrial and developing countries. Indeed, as Nigeria appears to demonstrate, following Paul Farmer's prescription of enough staff, stuff, equipment, space, isolation wards, and systems, contact tracing, etc., an outbreak can be thwarted. But with the Madrid hospital staff complaining about austerity's effects on budget and training, and more broadly a neoliberal rollback on public health infrastructure worldwide, any cordon is more likely a continuum. As 1918 showed, some localities will be better prepared than others. So should the outbreak continue, we should mentally prepare ourselves for some very messy outcomes, including perhaps here, stateside. Now today I'm going to address some ideas about the outbreak's origins. For some of you, this might help clarify the nature of the problematic. How did we get to this point? Others of you may be more confused than ever as the outbreak is asking us to examine some bedrock assumptions, not only about Ebola or disease in general, but some of the conceptual and material foundations of modern civilization. Successful outbreaks, after all, reflect the nature of the societies that select for them. The question will be whether we are ready to take responsibility. And therein lays one source of the cognitive dissonance. Institutions are as much about protecting themselves as their constituents. World War I destroyed the League of Nations, and a pandemic that kills 1 billion people, Ebola or otherwise, would surely put the UN and many a government on the chopping block. So even as panic as much enervates as threatens authority, outbreaks are politically trepidatious affairs. So let's start with the virus, which many a scientist, unfortunately, is also happy to stop with. The genus Ebola virus is comprised of 5 species of single-stranded RNA filoviruses that encode for 7 structural proteins and evolve at about 1/4 the rate of influenza in humans. The Ebola disease was named after the river in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, near which one of the first outbreaks was recorded in 1976. The 5 species are named after their geographic origin of identification: Bonyuboyo, Uganda; Reston, Virginia; Sudan; Thai Forest in Cote d'Ivoire; and Zaire, now the DRC. We see here the localities of the outbreaks marked by circles, whose sizes indicate the size of the outbreak, and whose shade of red indicate the date. The redder the circle, the more recent it is. It's the Zaire species that causes the worst case fatality rates. Transmission rates from close contact with blood, secretions, organs, or other bodily fluids, consumption of infected bushmeat, to which we will return, and touching objects that have come in contact with the virus, which in my mind, even if you're not regularly washing your dead, makes it seem a pretty infectious bug, certainly more so than HIV. Once inside its host, the virus, incubating about up to 21 days, targets hepatocytes in the liver, endothelial cells, lining blood vessels, and phagocytes that attack foreign antigens. The clinical course that results includes fever, sore throat, severe headache, muscle pain, intense weakness, vomiting, diarrhea, impaired liver and kidney function, which are noisy symptoms that could be caused just about any disease. And finally, unfortunately, the internal and external bleeding characteristic of Ebola's final stages, but also found in Lassa fever, another disease circulating in the region. The earliest documented cases of the West African outbreak appear to be a 2-year-old boy and his 3-year-old sister north of Gokido, a town of 200,000 people in the Guinean forest region. But the focus on an index case, patient 0, may miss the point. Ebola may have been spilling over for years, something Barry Hewlett's work in Uganda suggests local populations may have known and even taken precautions for. Indeed, epidemiologist Joseph Fair's group has found antibodies to multiple species of Ebola, including the Zaire strain, in patients in Sierra Leone as far back as 5 years ago. And phylogenetic work shows that the strain driving the present outbreak, on the left there, growing out of the Zaire clade, can be dated, on the top right there, as circulating in the area for as long as a decade. The explosion in the humans infected has additionally driven Ebola's evolutionary exploration of the human immune system and modes of transmission, with substitution rates within the 2014 outbreak, bottom center there, nearly double than all preceding outbreaks beforehand. The accumulation of genetic variation over time during the outbreak, bottom right, shows 50 mutational events and 29 new viral lineages across patients. The greater the chance to explore, the more likely Ebola will find the right balance of virulence and transmission, which spells bad news for humanity. Ebola threatens to build a better Ebola. This October 3rd map shows where the nearly 7,000 confirmed and probable cases are distributed across Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, although WHO suspects 20,000 cases, the surplus unreported. Cases older than 21 days are in gray, and those since are in red in active localities in the orange. We should note that spatial spread acts as more than a marker of new cases. It itself is a mechanism for the pathogen's survival. By expanding its characteristic area, Ebola entrains a greater number of communities into the epidemic. The more groups are affected, the more likely the epidemic will find populations that provide a good epidemiological fit, exhibiting the right combination of unsafe behaviors that power an outbreak. In addition, the more populations infected over a greater geographic extent, the less likely interventions of limited means can work, as in Sierra Leone, where CDC last week admitted a defeat, and the government, unable to take care of all cases showing up at clinics, moved toward allowing families to take care of their infected relatives. Which is understandable, but it also is how the epidemic got off to its start. Now, even if it remains the same virion, the same virus, in spreading, Ebola changes its very nature at the population level. Now, it isn't all about the virus, of course. The human costs on the ground are already accumulating, with teams collecting bodies every day. When and where they cannot, bodies here and there are left in the streets. Patients lucky enough to be reached or taken to facilities such as some of them are, while many others of the infected must suffer largely unattended in their neighborhood or village. Accounting for the likelihood cases are going unreported, a group at CDC projected infection growth in Sierra Leone and Liberia alone to reach 1.4 million by mid-January, if appropriate interventions were not instituted. That's on the left there. On the right, we have beds needed per day, and they're projected to peak at 100,000 in a region where a total of 900 beds are presently available. These structural failures are perhaps politicizing interventions. In August, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the health ministry of her health ministry, internalized the outbreak in Liberia by turning a primary school in West Point, Monrovia's poorest neighborhood, into the city's sole holding center for patients without informing local residents or providing patients even enough food. The government next quarantined the whole of the neighborhood with barbed wire and the Coast Guard on the waterfront, cutting off West Point residents from their jobs in the greater city, and, like neoliberalism and more generally, setting off food shortages and price spikes. The quarantine, set up in the middle of the night, drove hundreds of stone-throwing residents into running battles with the army manning the barbed wire, leaving 15-year-old Shami Kamara here in front, shot in the leg, to later die of his wounds, as much a victim of structurally imposed inequities as another teenager earlier this year in Missouri. If the West Africans were pilloried in Western media for their ignorance of Ebola etiology, how it develops, how it emerges, the censure should be placed in the other direction. For little effort has been dedicated to copying to the all-too-real pathogenesis of multinational land grabbing and structural adjustment, to which both rioting West Africans and the virus itself are responding, and to which we will now turn. Indeed, there appears considerable effort, conscious or not, to knock off such discussion from the start. While attacking the international inertia around the outbreak, University of Minnesota's own Mike Osterholm also argued Ebola a rolling series of black swans, evoking Nassim Taleb's notion of an unexpected event of great impact. According to Taleb, researchers confuse the frequency of events with their likely effect. So if something's rare, it's not going to affect us. Indeed, the black swan rejects the comforts of Gaussian statistics. Under the Mandelbrottian, the geometry of something approaching the black swan, the quantifiable dispersion of known and standard deviations are replaced with fractals that somewhat preserve probabilities across scales. So it's a technical discussion, and I'm going to avoid getting into the specifics of why I think Taleb's treatment is off, and by extension, Osterholm's. But the key point here is that so-called epidemiological surprises have their own political economy. We need to ask who knows or doesn't know, and who acts or fails to act on that knowledge. Many disease researchers know, for one, that turning poultry and livestock into monocultured widgets helps produce deadly epizootics, a conclusion suppressed here stateside with Lysenko's ferocity. Indeed, even as every one of the new flu recombinants in the last decade can be traced to industrial livestock of one kind or another. Many of the specifics of the Ebola outbreak aren't surprising either. Indeed, pathogens routinely trace society's inequalities and expropriations, like water traces cracks in ice. And the water movement seems random only if you're intent on avoiding looking at the underlying ice. There's a group of us writing a commentary to the effect that Ebola represents such a case. The shifts in land use in the Guinean forest region, where the new strain apparently emerged, are connected to the kinds of neoliberal structural adjustment that, alongside divesting public health infrastructure, open domestic food production to global circuits of capital. Bausch and Schwartz characterized the forest region as a mosaic of small and isolated populations of a variety of ethnic groups that hold little political power and receive little social investment. The forests economy and ecology are also strained by thousands of refugees from civil wars in neighboring countries. The region is subjected to the tandem trajectories of accelerating deterioration in public infrastructure and concerted efforts at private development, dispossessing small holdings in traditional foraging grounds for mining, clear-cut logging, and increasingly intensified agriculture. The hot zone as a whole comprises a part of the larger Guinea savanna zone the World Bank describes as one of the largest underused agricultural land reserves in the world. Africa hosts 60% of the world's last farmland frontier, and the bank sees the savanna best developed by market commercialization, if not solely on the agribusiness model. Such Arctic dreams, to reference Barry Lopez, are being realized south of the Sahara. Here we see the 90 deals by which U.S.-registered multinationals presently scored hundreds of thousands of hectares for export crops, biofuels, and mining. The Land Matrix Observatory shows similarly globalized distributions for the UK, France, China, and other powers. The land rush is on. Under the newly democratized Guinean government, the British-backed Farmland of Guinea Limited, now of Africa, secured 99-year leases for 2 parcels totaling nearly 9,000 hectares outside the village of Ndema and Konido in Dabolo Prefecture, where a secondary epicenter has since developed, and 98,000 hectares outside the village of Saraya in Korosa Prefecture. The new acquisitions, a symbolic start, are to be developed for maize and soybean. The Ministry of Agriculture has tasked farmland to survey and map an additional 1.5 million hectares for third-party development. An Italian energy company, meanwhile, scored 700,000 hectares for biofuel crops. And while these, as of yet, are undeveloped acquisitions are not directly tied to Ebola, they are markers of a complex, policy-driven phase change in agroecology that our group is hypothesizing undergirds Ebola's emergence here. Our thesis orbits around palm oil. Palm is a vegetable oil of highly saturated fats derived from the red mesocarp of the African oil palm tree, now grown around the world. The fruit's kernel also produces its own oil. Refined and fractionated into a variety of byproducts, both oils are used in an array of food, cosmetic, and cleaning products, as well as in some biodiesels. With the abandonment of trans fats, palm oil represents a growing market, with exports totaling nearly 45 million metric tons in the 2013-14 season globally. Oil palm plantations covering more than 17 million hectares worldwide, it's the size of Uruguay, are tied to deforestation and expropriation of lands from indigenous groups. We see from this FAO map that while most of the production can be found in Asia, particularly in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, most of the suitable land left for palm oil can be found in the Amazon and the Congo Basin, the 2 largest rainforests in the world. Palm oil represents a classic case of Lauderdale's paradox. As environmental resources are destroyed, what's left becomes more valuable. A decaying resource base, then, is no due cause for agribusiness turning into good global citizens, as industry-funded advocates have argued. On the contrary, agribusiness seeks secure and exclusive access to our now fiscally appreciating, if ecologically declining, landscapes. Now, Guinea, however, represents an interesting case. No multinational presently grows palm oil in Guinea directly or by subsidiary. Despite 2 million hectares of natural and traditionally cultivated stands, Guinea trails even Liberia's weak sector. The black there are Guinea, gray is Liberia, dashes are imports, solid exports, the palm oil on the left and palm kernels on the right. In short, not much action, save more imports than exports. Only recently has Guinea begun a push toward commoditizing the crop in the face of cheap imports from Asia. As of 2007, government plans include expanding family industrial production to 15,000 hectares and 84,000 tons of palm oil by 2015, more than half of the latter to be produced by forest region plantations. Natural and semi-wild groves of different oil palm types, Dura, Piscifera, and Tenera, have long served as a source of red palm oil in the region. Contrary to the pre-Lapsarian fantasies of hunter-gatherers, forest farmers have been raising palm oil in one or another form for hundreds of years. Fallow periods allowing soils to recover, however, were reduced over the 20th century from 20 years in the 1930s to 10 in the 1970s and still further by the 2000s. With the added effect of increasing grove density. Concomitantly, semi-wild production has been increasingly replaced with intensive hybrids, and red oil replaced by or mixed with industrial and kernel oils. Other crops are grown in the forest as well, of course. Regional shade agriculture includes coffee, cocoa, cola, slash and burn rice, maize, hibiscus, and corns of the first year, followed by peanut and cassava of the second, and a fallow period, are rotated through the agroforest. Lowland flooding supports rice. In essence, we see a move toward intensification without private capital, but still classifiable as agroforestry. But even this kind of farming has since been transformed. The Guinean Society of Oil, Palm, and Rubber, with the French acronym SOGIPA, began in 1987 as a parastatal cooperative in the forest, but since has grown to the point it is better characterized as a state company. It is leading efforts that began in 2006 to develop plantations of intensive hybrid palm for commodity export. SOGIPA economized palm production for the market by forcibly expropriating farmland, which to this day continues to set off violent protest, including in 2011 when villagers were run off their fields and were forced to find refuge in a church in the provincial capital. International aid, meanwhile, has accelerated industrialization. The mill shown here, with 4 times the capacity of one SOGIPA previously used, was financed by the European Investment Bank. The mill's capacity ended the artisanal extraction that as late as 2010 provided local populations full employment. The subsequent increase in seasonal production has at one and the same time led to harvesting above the mill's capacity and operation below capacity off-season, leading to a conflict between the company and some of its 2,000 now partially proletarianized pickers, some of whom insist on processing a portion of their own yield to cover the resulting gaps in cash flow. They need money during the off-season, so they do it their way. The pickers who insist on processing their own oil during the rainy season, however, now risk arrest. So the new economic geography has initiated a classic case of land expropriation and enclosure, turning a tradition of shared forest commons toward expectations that informal pickers working fallow land outside their family lineage obtain an owner's permission before picking palm. Now what does this have to do with Ebola, right? Went through this whole thing. This figure shows an archipelago of oil palm plots in the Guinea area. The outbreak's apparent ground zero. The characteristic landscape is a mosaic of villages surrounded by dense vegetation and interspersed by crop fields of oil palm in the red and patches of open forest and regenerated young forest. The general pattern can be discerned at finer scales as well. Here, west of the town, Miliandu. The landscape embodies a growing interface between humans and frugivore bats, a key Ebola reservoir, including hammer-headed bats on the upper left, little collared fruit bats on the upper right, and franchied fruit bats on the lower left. And on the lower right there is the 3 bats relative composite distribution map. Saifi and colleagues document a variety of disturbance-associated fruit bats attracted to oil palm plantations. Bats migrate to oil palm for food and shelter from the heat, while the plantation's wide trails also permit easy movement between roosting and foraging sites. Oil palm picking in the forest region occurs year-round, but the biggest push takes place at the start of the dry season, when many bat species migrate and several epidemics have begun across Africa. So we need to avoid the mistake of thinking bats just go to the same place all the time, and that's just their nature, and that's what they do. They're not programmed, and they're not stupid. They appear to display the kind of plastic biogeography migratory waterfowl do. When their natural wetland habitat along the Gulf of Mexico was destroyed by development, lesser snow geese took to summering as far north as Minnesota, feeding on the waste grain in the fields of farms. The new food fueled a population explosion in lesser snow geese, which led the geese into grubbing bare their breeding grounds around La Perouse Bay in Hudson. The tundra grasslands there are turning into a mud pit because of the overpopulation of the bird. It is eminently conceivable that Ebola-bearing bats are making way to the crops, taking their destroyed natural habitats' place. Leroy and colleagues tracked back the transmission rates of an Ebola outbreak around 10 villages in the DRC in 2007 to the massive annual bat migration along the river Lua, including 2 of the 3 species that are likely Ebola reservoirs. Each year, bats arrive in their thousands and settle briefly on the islands in the river, foraging in the fruit trees there. A massive palm oil plantation was developed close by the river in 1925 and cultivated in such a way that production peaked in April of each year when the bats arrived. The researchers declared the plantation was no doubt an important food source for bats for more than half a century, developing into a stopover on their migratory path. The plantation, now largely neglected, still represents a place where bats can feed undisturbed. Local hunters shoot bats there on a daily basis when the bats are there. Some of the hunters kill bats with machetes, catapults, and by hand, supplying the weekly market at one of the 10 villages. So bushmeat is certainly one way a spillover may have occurred in the DRC and perhaps Guinea. But to move away from the Ooga Booga epidemiology, cultivation may be enough. Fruit bats in Bangladesh transmitted Nipah virus to human hosts by urinating on the date fruit of the planted palm trees humans cultivated. Now, what does this all mean? First, what's happening in Guinea isn't merely a matter of Guinea. Here's a global risk map of emergent zoonotics produced by a number of luminaries in the field of eco-health. It's based on a logistic regression of present absence of all newly emergent diseases since 1940 against such drivers as human population density and wildlife diversity. The warmer the color, the more likely a new pathogen surge should emerge there. But in treating disease strictly in terms of ecological theory, and in conflating geography in this absolute space for causality, the map misses a critical point that in some instances could very well reverse initial conclusions. So let's take influenza H5N1 bird flu, which clearly emerged in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong in 1996 before spilling over into nearby Hong Kong. But when we include what we've learned about the economic relationship Hong Kong and Guangdong share, causality shifts direction. By the 1990s, the relationship had returned to pre-revolutionary dynamics whereby Hong Kong acts as a proverbial front of the store, providing capital and marketing for Guangdong, the back of the store, where production takes place. Indeed, at the time of H5N1's emergence, 4/5 of the foreign direct investment through Hong Kong went to Guangdong, including backing the shifts in agriculture and land use implicated in disease emergence. So contrary to the morality tale that repeatedly characterized Hong Kong as some innocent victim, Hong Kong appears as responsible as Guangdong for H5N1, and causality moves in other directions as well. So with these complications in mind, I started working with the University of Washington's Luke Bergman to test whether the world's circuits of capital as they relate to husbandry and land use are related to disease emergence. Here we have the percent of land whose harvests are consumed abroad as agricultural goods in green, or in manufactured goods and services in blue. In this way, the source of disease may not merely be the countries in which new diseases first appear. It may extend as far as the other side of the world. We need to identify who funded the development in deforestation to begin with, as seen here in a capital accumulation and consumption across croplands, pasture lands, and forests. It begs whether we might more accurately characterize such places as New York, London, and Hong Kong, key sources of capital, as disease hotspots in their own right.